5 years ago, I learned what nobody tells you about rebuilding your life after losing everything from a hospital bed burned by radiation, as I got the call that my father was dying of cancer too. The stale hospital air, the beeping machines, my mother's broken voice, that was my rock bottom. But here's what nobody tells you about rebuilding your life after losing everything. It's not about bouncing back to who you were. It's about discovering what you're actually made of when everything you thought defined you is gone. Growing up poor with domestic violence wasn't just about empty fridges or bruises that needed covering. It was about learning to make yourself invisible at school because your clothes smelled like cigarettes and fear. It was about being the kid other parents whispered about, the one who didn't get invited to birthday parties because broken families are contagious, right? I thought surviving that childhood meant I could handle anything. I was wrong. At 19, I stepped off a plane in a foreign country with nothing but hope and a suitcase that weighed more than my bank account. I believed the stories we tell ourselves about fresh starts and new beginnings. I thought geographical distance could heal generational trauma. The culture shock hit like a physical blow. Everything I knew about how to be human suddenly didn't apply. The language I'd studied for years felt foreign in my mouth. People looked at me differently when I spoke, like my accent carried all my poverty with it. You think surviving your childhood prepares you for anything, but what happens when life keeps taking everything you love? What happens when those people who promised to catch you let you fall? What happens when your body betrays you just as you're finally building something that feels like home? I learned that rebuilding from complete devastation isn't about positive thinking or gratitude journals. It's about making peace with the parts of yourself that got forged in fire. It's about understanding that your breaking points aren't where you end, they're where you begin. What I learned about rebuilding your life after losing everything will change how you see your own breaking points forever. Because here's the truth about your future self that nobody tells you. They're not waiting for you to heal from your trauma. Your future self exists because of how you chose to transform it. Arriving in a new country at 19 felt like being dropped onto an alien planet where everyone knew the rules except me. The friends who'd promised to help me navigate this new world, they vanished the moment I actually needed them. Sarah and Mike had seemed so genuine when we met online. They painted pictures of weekend adventures and a ready-made social circle waiting for me. But when I called Sarah crying after my first week of job rejections, she suddenly became too busy to answer. Mike stopped responding to my texts altogether. I learned that some people collect broken birds not to heal them, but to feel better about their own cages. The job discrimination was a special kind of humiliation. I'd show up to interviews overqualified on paper, only to watch employers' faces change the moment I opened my mouth. My accent became a neon sign flashing foreign and other. Managers would literally wince when I spoke, like my voice was physically painful to hear. That's how I ended up accepting a full-time job at a juvenile detention center. It wasn't a calling or a career move, it was desperation. They needed someone who could work irregular shifts and weekend shifts, and I needed someone who would hire me despite my accent. I thought it was temporary, just until something better came along. But working with those juveniles changed something in me. They were carrying trauma that made my childhood look easy, yet they still found ways to laugh, to hope, to dream about futures that seemed impossible from where they sat. Watching them fight for better lives while society had already written them off reminded me why I'd survived my own hell in the first place. Then my body decided to join the rebellion against my life. Finding that lump felt like the universe's sick joke. I was finally building something that resembled stability, and now this? Getting cancer during COVID meant navigating an overwhelmed healthcare system while the world locked down around me. Radiation treatment sessions in an empty hospital, wearing masks over masks, watching nurses who looked as scared as I felt. The breaking point came during my third round of radiation treatment. My phone rang, and it was my mother's voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Rebecca, your father has cancer too. Terminal. The doctors say maybe 3 months." I stared at the ceiling while the radiation machine hummed, beams targeting my body to kill the poison in my cells, and I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming until my throat bled. here I was, fighting for my life, and now I had to watch my father lose his fight too. Flying home for his funeral felt like traveling backward through time. The poverty I'd escaped was still there, waiting for me like an old coat that no longer fit but somehow still smelled like home. Standing at his graveside, I realized I was grieving more than just his death. I was grieving the father I'd needed him to be, the childhood I'd never had, the safety net that had never existed. But life wasn't done with me yet. 8 months after burying my father, my aunt called with news that made my knees buckle. They'd found my cousin dead in his home. The autopsy revealed it was metastatic cancer. Another funeral, another goodbye, another piece of my heart carved out with surgical precision. That's when I discovered the first brutal truth about rebuilding from nothing. Sometimes you have to lose everything twice before you understand what you're actually made of. Standing in my empty apartment after my cousin's funeral, I realized I was grieving multiple losses simultaneously, and none of them were waiting politely for their turn. My health, my father, my sense of safety in the world, they were all demanding attention at once, like children screaming in a crowded room. The grief counselors talk about stages like they're neat little boxes you move through in order: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. What they don't tell you is that grief is more like weather, unpredictable, messy, and completely indifferent to your schedule. You can be angry at cancer in the morning and bargaining with God by lunch. Flying home from my father's funeral felt like stepping into a life that no longer fit. The poverty I'd escaped was still there, unchanged, like a museum exhibit of everything I'd run from. My childhood bedroom looked exactly the same, but I felt like a stranger visiting someone else's past. The scared 19-year-old who'd left with nothing but hope seemed like a different person entirely. The anger phase hit me like a freight train. I was furious at cancer for being so indiscriminate in its cruelty. I was angry at poverty for stealing my father's chances at better health care. I was livid at a world that seemed designed to break people like us, immigrants, survivors, the ones who'd already paid more than our share. But the anger that surprised me most was the rage I felt toward my younger self. How naive she'd been, thinking that leaving home would solve everything. How she'd believed that hard work and determination were enough to overcome systemic barriers. How she'd trusted those people who, like I'd learned before, collected broken birds not to heal them, but to feel superior. There was one specific night, about a month after my father's funeral, when everything collapsed. I was lying on my bathroom floor, crying for that scared 19-year-old who'd thought geographical distance could heal generational trauma. I was mourning her innocence, her hope, her belief that the world was fundamentally fair. As if my suffering wasn't enough, I received that phone call with the news that my cousin had been found dead. The timing felt like cosmic cruelty, as if the universe was testing exactly how much loss one person could absorb before completely shattering. I remember thinking, this isn't real, this can't be happening again. But it was happening again. Cancer doesn't care about your healing timeline or your capacity for grief. It doesn't wait for you to process one loss before delivering another. My cousin, who'd been my childhood confidant, the one person who understood what our family's dysfunction had cost us, had lost the same battle that had claimed my father 8 months earlier. Seeing how quickly illness took hold taught me something brutal about grief. It's not a problem to be solved or a phase to be completed. It's a companion you learn to live with, like chronic pain that flares up when you least expect it. Some days you can barely feel it. Other days it takes your breath away. The double loss taught me that healing isn't linear. It's messy and unpredictable and completely uninterested in your plans. You can't schedule your breakdown for convenient times. You can't negotiate with grief or bargain your way through it faster. It moves at its own pace, following its own logic that makes no sense to anyone else. I learned to stop apologizing for my tears in grocery stores, for the panic attacks that hit during mundane conversations, for the way certain songs could reduce me to sobbing in public. Grief doesn't wait for permission, and neither should your healing. The most important lesson came when I realized I wasn't just grieving deaths. I was grieving all the versions of myself that had died along the way. The trusting girl who'd believed in fairy tale endings. the optimistic immigrant who'd thought hard work guaranteed success, the healthy woman who'd taken her body for granted. You can't rebuild while pretending your pain doesn't matter. You have to acknowledge every loss, even the ones that feel too small or too complicated to name. Only then can you start building something real on the foundation of who you actually are, not who you wish you could be. Working in the juvenile detention center during my darkest period saved my life in ways I couldn't have predicted. These weren't the grateful, inspiring juveniles you see in movies. They were angry, broken, and completely uninterested in my personal drama. They called out weakness like bloodhounds, and somehow that brutal honesty became exactly what I needed. There was one boy, Marcus, who reminded me why I'd survived my own childhood trauma. 15 years old with eyes that had seen too much. He'd been bouncing between foster homes since he was 7. During one of our sessions, he looked at me and said, "You think you're helping us? But you're just another adult who's gonna leave." His words hit like a slap because they were true. I was planning to leave as soon as something better came along, but sitting there, looking at this boy who'd been abandoned by every adult who was supposed to protect him, I realized something had shifted in me. I wasn't just working there anymore, I was fighting for something that mattered. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. Instead of seeing my immigration struggle as shame I needed to overcome, I started viewing it as strength I'd earned through fire. My accent wasn't evidence of not belonging. It was proof that I'd been brave enough to build a life from nothing. The daily practice that saved me was simple but transformative. Every morning I'd ask myself, what would someone who survived this much choose now? Not what would make other people comfortable, not what looked good on paper, but what would honor the strength it had taken to get here. When I felt overwhelmed by medical bills, I'd ask the question and choose to research payment plans instead of hiding from the debt. When loneliness threatened to swallow me whole, I'd ask myself the question and choose to book that solo trip to the Dominican Republic instead of staying home, feeling sorry for myself. Traveling the world while rebuilding my life wasn't Instagram-worthy self-discovery. It was messy, scary, and often lonely. But every stamp in my passport became evidence that I could create beauty from ashes. Every conversation with strangers in broken English reminded me that connection doesn't require perfection. I learned to see my scars as proof of resilience, not evidence of damage. The mark from my radiation treatment became a reminder that I'd chosen to fight. The emotional scars from childhood trauma became evidence that I'd survived what should have destroyed me. Small, honest choices started building a foundation I could actually trust, choosing vulnerability over perfection, choosing growth over comfort, choosing to help other people navigate their storms instead of just surviving my own. Your breaking point becomes your breaking open when you stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming through this?" There was a morning, about 6 months after my cousin's funeral, when I woke up and realized I'd stopped asking, "Why me?" The shift was so subtle I almost missed it, but suddenly the question in my head was different. Who am I becoming through this? That simple change in perspective cracked something open inside me. Instead of seeing myself as a victim of circumstances, I started seeing myself as someone being shaped by fire into something stronger, more compassionate, more real. I started doing this visualization that changed everything. I'd picture myself 5 years in the future, not the glossy, perfect version from magazines, but the real woman who'd been forged by loss and rebuilt herself from the ground up. She had lines around her eyes from crying and laughing in equal measure. Her hands were steady because they'd held other people through their darkest moments. Her voice was calm because she'd screamed until she had nothing left, then found her true voice in the silence. This future version of myself would look at me with such compassion and say, "This is making you who you need to be. Not who you want to be or who others expect you to be, but who the world needs you to become." She became my compass. When I felt like giving up on my work at the juvenile detention center, I'd ask, what would the woman I'm becoming choose here? She'd choose to stay because those juveniles needed someone who understood what it felt like to be written off by the world. When I was scared to book that flight to Fuerteventura because traveling alone felt too vulnerable, I'd ask the question again. She'd choose courage over comfort because she knew that hiding from life wasn't healing. It was just surviving in a prettier package. When I felt guilty for finding joy after so much loss, she'd remind me that happiness wasn't betraying my grief. It was honoring everyone I'd lost by refusing to waste the life they'd never get to live. My future self helped me see trauma as transformation, not just survival. Every panic attack became evidence that I was brave enough to feel everything instead of numbing out. Every moment of loneliness became proof that I valued real connection over superficial comfort. Every scar became a map of where I'd been and how far I'd traveled. The most profound shift came when I realized my future self wasn't despite my pain. She existed because of how I chose to transform it. The woman helping other people navigate their storms had been shaped by learning to weather her own. The person who could sit with someone else's grief without trying to fix it had been taught by loss. The advocate who fought for forgotten juveniles had been forged by being forgotten herself. Your future self isn't waiting for you to heal from your trauma. They're not standing at the finish line of your recovery, tapping their foot impatiently while you figure things out. Your future self exists because of how you choose to transform your pain into purpose, your scars into strength, your breaking points into breaking open. The woman I'm becoming looks at me with gratitude, not pity. She's grateful for every tear that taught me empathy, every loss that showed me what really matters, every moment I chose growth over comfort. She knows that everything I've survived was preparing me for everything I'm meant to become. If you're in the middle of your own storm right now, feeling like everything is falling apart at once, I need you to hear this. You're not broken by what's happening to you. You're being broken open for who you're meant to become. Stop trying to be who you were before the storm. That person served their purpose, but they weren't built for what you're facing now. The person you're becoming is stronger, wiser, more compassionate than you can imagine from where you're sitting. The first step that changed everything for me was this. I stopped waiting for permission to rebuild my life differently. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, for having an accent, for carrying scars, for needing time to grieve. I started building a life that honored everything I'd survived instead of hiding from it. This process isn't pretty or Instagram worthy, but it's real. There will be days when you cry in grocery stores and nights when you can't sleep because the future feels too uncertain. There will be moments when you question everything and people who don't understand why you're not over it yet. But here's what I know after losing everything twice. You're not broken by what happened to you. You're being broken open for who you're meant to become. Your future self is already proud of you for surviving this much. Now it's time to start building something beautiful from the pieces. If you're ready to take the next step in building your future self, watch my video on the 3 non-negotiable habits for your future self. These are the daily practices that will bridge the gap between who you are now and who you're becoming. Click the link in the description or the video on your screen right now.